HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Risk-Work, Essays on the Organizational Life of Risk Management, by Michael Power. Read by Shawn Compton. Introduction. Risk-Work, the Organizational Life of Risk Management. Michael Power. In 1976, Barry Turner analyzed a variety of disasters and accidents. He found that these events exhibited very similar patterns, not least missed opportunities to react to warning signs during what he called the incubation period. A few years later, Charles Perrow applied his own prior work on complex organizations to the case of the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor accident in 1979. Perrow used the case to argue that accidents were somehow a normal feature of large and complex technological systems, which were increasingly opaque to human actors. The work of both Turner and Perrow has been controversial and much debated, both in terms of the former's hindsight bias and the latter's apparent technological determinism. Yet jointly their work established a subfield for subsequent organization-based studies focused on accidents and disasters. Notwithstanding their controversies, the methodological and policy messages of this work embody a common message. Disaster analysis, whether by academics or policymakers, needs to look beyond the proximate technical causes of failures and accidents and pay attention to the role of management practice and values. In short, the origins of disaster should be traced back to the mundane levels of organizational life, to climates of tolerance for routine operational errors, to failures in legal compliance, and to weak monitoring and control practices. As Vaughan puts it in the context of the Challenger disaster in 1985, no extraordinary actions by individuals explain what happened. No intentional managerial wrongdoing, no rule violations, no conspiracy. The cause of the disaster was a mistake embedded in the banality of organizational life. It is understandable that the study of risk and risk management in organizations is heavily influenced by disasters. Each new one brings both disappointment with the way risk was managed and a search for reform. These events are often spectacular and headline-grabbing, and there seems to be no shortage of them. They generate public inquiries, diagnoses, blame, and post-disaster introspection about what went wrong and how it might have been prevented. Yet, it is possible to analyze risk management practice without this implicit orientation towards failure of some kind. While the prevention of errors, accidents, and disasters is the very point of formal risk management, can we bracket this perspective and focus on normal risk processing practices and how they are constituted by organizational actors and material artifacts? The chapters in the present volume are commonly motivated to do this and approach risk management as a form of organizational work. Unencumbered by assumptions about incubation periods and missed warnings, the aim of this collection is to reveal more of the day-to-day nature of risk processing activity across a variety of organizational settings and fields. This is not so much a radical break with the preoccupations of disaster theorists, but an attempt to pay more attention to the normal, even banal work routines, as Vaughan suggests. Organizational encounters with risk and error are not restricted to the sensational cases that draw media coverage when mistakes, near misses, and accidents become public. They are, instead, a routine, a systematic part of daily organizational life that only occasionally becomes visible to outsiders. There is a vast and growing literature on risk and risk management, both practical and academic. This textual expansion mirrors the increased salience of risk management for organizations and governments. Scholars and practitioners know a great deal about the various techniques of risk management, such as diversification, insurance, and scenario analysis. There have also been many studies of the politics of risk regulation, the organization of risk regulation regimes, and the institutional and cultural climates of blame, which accompany the management of risk. Another important intellectual focus has been individual perceptions of and feelings about risk. Within these different strands of scholarship, risk management is variously conceptualized as a branch of knowledge, as a site for the interplay and competition of interests, as an effective counter between individuals and dangers, and as part of a regulated world of standards. And of course, there has been much debate about whether we live in a risk society. Despite this body of scholarly and practical analysis of risk management, the normal non-post-disaster work of organizational actors has received much less attention. Furthermore, risk studies in the shadow of disaster tend to have an epistemic presumption that the negative outcome was in principle foreseeable and avoidable. However, each of the chapters here is concerned more with everyday processes rather than momentous events. Whether an organization is in an incubation period or not is empirically open in these analyses rather than being a retrospectively applied construct. This introductory chapter sets the scene and provides a synthesis of the volume as a whole. Overall, the chapters which follow contribute to a field that might be called back-office studies, and to a growing body of research on institutional work. They provide several rich cases of the situated human effort, in combination with material infrastructure, through which risk management and governance practices come to be constructed. In the next section, this risk work, to coin a term, is positioned within a more general turn to work in management and organization studies. This section is followed by synopses of each chapter according to 3 thematic clusters: frameworks, risk identification, and affect and persuasion. The first cluster of chapters addresses the work related to the development and operationalization of formal aspects of risk management, oversight frameworks, risk maps, and key risk indicators. The second cluster of chapters deals with the work involved in identifying and constructing specific risk objects. The third cluster deals with the more agonistic and emotional aspects of risk work, such as efforts to persuade and enroll organizational actors to manage risk and take it seriously. These chapter synopses are followed by a discussion of their collective contribution to our understanding of risk work as being diverse and plural in nature, mediated by material artifacts, and distributed within and across organizations. The turn to work, risk from the bottom up. The turn to work in risk management studies continues an earlier social turn in the study of both risk and regulation, which demanded attention to the social and political dimensions of risk analysis. This social turn in risk studies took many forms. It recognized the importance of values and choice, not simply in risk acceptance, but also in risk identification and in the techniques of risk analysis itself, the heartland of rational risk calculation. It was in part a critique of expertise coupled to a concern to democratize risk regulation. It also saw the emergence of both psychological studies of individual risk perception and also macro-cultural theories of risk. In parallel, the law and society movement and the rise of socio-legal studies of risk and regulation played an important supportive role in moving from the study of law on the books to law where it happens and is enforced. This social turn in risk studies also built on the sociology of everyday life by examining experiences of risk beyond the workplace, for example, in family life and relationships, in health and aging, and in leisure activities. Furthermore, and in reaction to the self-styled technical autonomy of risk analysis, risk studies have both historicized risk and also recognized that material artifacts and representations of risk play a critical role in reproducing everyday organizational life. Though different in focus and methodological orientation, these different social pathways within risk and regulation studies share a bottom-up approach to the understanding of risk, rooted in everyday practices within and outside of formal organizations, and informed by analyses of the way human actors make sense of risk in complex environments and in reaction to events. This bottom-up agenda in risk studies also requires the analysis of organizational and information design issues in risk management. In trying to escape from the focus on disasters, Burrier argues that researchers should pay more attention to systems and processes which are green rather than ignored warnings and misdeeds, an agenda already implicit in Vaughan's analysis of the Challenger-launched disaster. While Vaughan's concept of the normalization of deviance, which emerged from her study of NASA, is largely understood in terms of rule-breaking, which is ignored or sanctioned in some way, she also draws attention to the incremental expansion of normative boundaries, which have nothing to do with norm violations in the commonly accepted sense. For Burrier, this insight supports a critique of post-event analyses by both academics and formal commissions for being too actor-focused and unable to surface the causal role played by organizational design issues. Burrier suggests that public diagnoses and recommendations are often framed in terms of information deficits and the need for new reporting requirements, or in general terms of a need to improve organizational culture. In the context of the 2009 financial crisis, she has a point. A great deal of attention and energy has been focused on the cultural causes of the crisis, the ethics and incentives inside banks, and on the need to restore a healthy risk culture. Rather, Burrier argues that scholars need to examine the normal functioning of organizations and, in particular, changes in crucial organizational patterns and associated changes in social relations as a result of new techniques and ways of working. Rather than deviant normalities or rogue behavior, it is the disturbance of social relations which greatly impacts the social construction of reliability. Bottom-up studies of risk management in organizations can draw intellectual support from a more general turn to work, itself a reaction to the perceived inadequacies of increasing abstraction in organization studies in explaining post-industrial societies. Barley and Kunda argue that the scholarly focus on new kinds of work and on networks are themselves overstated reactions to post-industrialism and do not escape petrified images of work. Instead of sloganistic positing of a world without boundaries, they call for a return to rich descriptions of where and how boundaries are drawn, and how the units of analysis for work, projects rather than jobs, and agents, intermediaries rather than workers, may be changing. Methodologically, this requires more participant observation and augmented observational capacity, a feature of many of the chapters here, which is capable of generating new analytic concepts. According to Barley and Kunda, this refocusing on work has many potential payoffs, such as an enhanced sense of communities of practice, as units of analysis in which decision-making or learning are no longer conceived as singular cognitive acts. Indeed, the turn to work potentially reveals the flows of choreographed attending and the grammar of organization routines which have more to do with situation and accumulated micro-actions than with deliberation. As Phillips and Lawrence put it, one of the powerful effects of adopting a work lens is a shift from the outcomes of action to the actors involved and the action itself. The work lens is itself hardly new. Sociologies of work reach back at least to the ethno-methodological studies by Garfinkel and colleagues. They observed the skilled reproduction of social and organizational order and elicited the implicit assumptions sustaining that order within the accounts embedded in practical reasoning. While contingent assumptions and categories become habitualized and exteriorized as objective facts, human actors are also inventive in sustaining a reasonable world of work. Furthermore, as Backus's detailed study of the safety regulation of multi-piece track wheels shows, the situated logics of safety evident in the workplace may be different from top-down regulator logics of safety, yielding different but equally legitimate ways of providing accounts of risk. Indeed, this tension between the formal and the situated underlies many of the chapters of this book. Although ethno-methodology was never developed into an expansive field, it spawned many variants and has had continuing influence, not least on Weick's sense-making program, which focuses in part on how the sustaining of identities and reciprocal relations are at stake in habituated practical action. In an analysis which has become foundational for risk studies, the Mann-Gulch disaster, Weick shows how the firefighters who perished had both underestimated the danger and were also unable to adapt their work identities in an increasingly confusing situation. More generally, the sense-making approach shows how disasters may be situated in the everyday habits of actors who attend to the signs in the environment that conform to their expectations and idiosyncratic logics of work. For risk studies, the sense-making approach requires an emphasis on the cognitive aspects of work, rather than on willful noncompliance or deviance, and on the systematic patterns in vocabularies which shape the attention of organizational actors. Like Weick, Phillips and Lawrence also emphasize how the turn to work must take account of the increased salience of identity issues in post-industrial societies. Forms of work focused on the production and reproduction of symbols, including those expressing institutional orders, are increasingly prevalent activities in and across organizations, including organized markets. For example, many of the major risks facing the post-industrial organizations are legal and reputational. In other words, they are a product of the organizational environment itself and require new work forms to manage them more explicitly. From this point of view, practice is not merely the sharing of operational routines across groups of actors, but often and simultaneously the performance of socially legitimate activity as a kind of institutional risk management. Phillips and Lawrence suggest that this post-industrial entanglement of work identity and social legitimacy issues explains why organizational units, which were regarded as marginal to first-order production, such as human resources, have become more significant over time. For example, the rise of equal opportunities programs increased the organizational significance of human resource departments. Successive disasters and scandals also increase the organizational significance of risk. Organizational risk management has evolved beyond the purchasing of insurance to become a mode of governing the organization as such via generic templates and categorizations. Furthermore, risk has become an identity issue, as the everyday work of many organizational actors is increasingly articulated in the language of risk, while new dedicated roles, such as Chief Risk Officers, CROs, have emerged. Yet many of the chapters in here testify to the fluidity of the interface between dedicated risk functions and other parts of organizations. For example, as Mike's shows in her contribution, CROs are engaged in continuous and often self-effacing work at the boundary between their formal oversight role and the need to generate relationships and reciprocal support for risk management. Zhivitskaya and Power observe how non-executive directors with risk oversight responsibilities must improvise between their potentially dissonant identities as both overseer and colleague of the executives. And Fisher and McGivern describe an even more fluid identity situation in which patients and medical staff co-produce the management of risk. It follows that an empirical and theoretical turn to work in risk studies requires methodological agnosticism about who does the work of managing risk and about the boundaries of risk management practice. For example, the sense-making perspective adopted by a number of chapters suggests that the work of risk identification sits outside and has a complex relationship to formal risk management systems, not least in so-called high-reliability environments, which require habituated forms of attention and mindfulness. Furthermore, formal risk management systems may or may not have work streams to capture and process these constructions of risk by situated actors for whom getting the job done is at least as important as conforming to official norms of safety. To repeat, the focus on work means that the very idea of risk management as an institutional category cannot be taken for granted, but is continuously pulled into different micro-accounts of organizational work practices by a multiplicity of actors who, from the bottom up, more or less reproduce the category. However, following Noor Cetina, the turn towards an ethno-methodologically inspired micro-sociology of risk management work should not be confused with smallness of focus or the prioritization of individual decision-making. The emphasis is rather on forms of interaction, understood as the interlocking of intentionalities. In turn, these intentionalities are not individual acts of rational cognition, but are context-referring, including institutional context, and are defined by forms of reciprocity which make action describable and understandable in the first place. In short, individual purposeful action about risk is not the primary unit of analysis, but, as Varga shows in her chapter, is derived from episodes of situated interaction, which are generative of identities and their decision capabilities. This methodological sensationalism, as Noor Satina calls it, has affinities with Latour's account of actor network theory. Importantly, both emphasize the theoretical and empirical significance of technologies of representation and the non-human material artifacts which mediate the sense-making of actors, and are a mechanism by which reciprocal relations and connections between organizational actors are created and sustained in action nets. A micro-sociological focus on technologies of representation parallels studies of the constitutive role of accounting in reproducing organizations as economic entities. It has also surfaced within the relatively new subfield of social studies of finance, which posits that the economy is literally performed through the repeated use of models and related artifacts. Millow and McKinsey's analysis of options trading provides a very specific case of performativity in which the options market increasingly conforms to theories of it. Via the theory of options pricing, a mathematized risk management model generates the world of its own applicability. Though not quite examples of this kind of pure performativity, the chapters by Jordan and Jorgensen on risk maps and Hall and Fernando on risk indicators show directly how these specific technologies of representation are positioned within and are generative of work practices. Such technologies are also accounts of work in Garfinkel's sense and constitute work identities. Like accounting statements, risk maps and risk indicators produce the organizational facts of risk, which become reciprocally embedded in the intentionalities of actors. One cannot be understood without the other. This broad micro-sociological point of view, with its many sources and variations, defines the space of the chapters that follow and their common focus on the work of managing risk, on risk work. In contrast to the implied unity and coherence of risk management as a category, the idea of risk work makes no presumptions of coherent practice and directs attention to the actions and routines through which organizational actors make sense of risk, of themselves and their roles, and collectively try to enact institutional scripts. Against the often implicit epistemological assumption in many risk studies that risk management is a form of knowledge grounded in statistical thinking and conducted as punctuated episodes of calculation, the focus on risk work is agnostic about what counts as the management of risk. From this point of view, risk management practice and the ability to package it and make it visible and institutionally acceptable must be understood as an outcome of varied forms of risk work rather than a starting point or presumption. The studies of risk work which follow can be positioned as part of a larger, if widely dispersed, genre of back-office studies. Back-office here is intended in two senses. The first is the literal distinction between the front and back office, which is in common use in financial institutions. Back office in this sense seems to denote something like infrastructure, namely the administrative and regulatory activities, which are conditions of possibility for trading and even for markets themselves to exist. The everyday life of this back office is an object of scholarly attention by anthropologists, organization theorists, and science studies specialists. And this work creates an understanding of back office in the second sense, reaching back to Goffman's backstage of face-to-face practice, of the work that creates order and representations of orderliness, the work by which rational organizational narratives of risk, control, and governance come to be assembled and exported to different audiences. There are useful affinities between Goffman's backstage and Foucault's notion of an apparatus. Both are characterized by a kind of unobservability, which is essential to their role in constructing common sense. It follows that back-office stage analysts must read the signs of that which is normally unseen. Finally, a focus on risk work does not ignore the salience of disasters and spectacular events. This would be unwise on historical grounds, since risk management practices evolve in the wake of accidents and scandals, mediated by public inquiries and new forms of regulation. However, the turn to work requires a provisional bracketing of the disaster bias, however difficult, in order to bring to the surface the assumptions that sustain the practice of risk management. Such a bracketing enables the link to accidents to be recast as a series of ex-ante inquiries without any hindsight bias. In other words, for each of the chapters which follow, it could be asked whether the bottom-up analysis of risk work reveals that the organization or field is in an incubation period or not, and whether the normality on show is somehow potentially or actually deviant or not. These are, of course, much harder questions to answer than in the case of post-disaster analysis for two main reasons. First, the question of incubation or deviance at any particular time is a function of the different values which constitute the culture of managing risk, and is therefore more contestable ex ante than in retrospective analyses. Second, it may be the case that such questions cannot be answered on epistemic grounds. Certain kinds of failure may not in principle be knowable in advance. The chapter summaries which follow are clustered in terms of their orientation to one of three themes. The first theme concerns the work involved in generating and sustaining many of the formal components of risk management practice: risk frameworks, risk maps, key risk indicators, and models of risk oversight such as the 3 lines of defense. The second theme concerns the kinds of work and routines involved in producing and attending to risk objects themselves, involving implicit value judgments in combination with technologies and instruments. The third theme addresses the affective dimension of risk work and the conflicts and emotions at stake, including network building and identity issues, which give risk management from the bottom up its human and visceral character. Frameworks and designs. The practical field of risk management is heavily populated by frameworks and designs which have been widely institutionalized, which project a rational image of practice, and which prescribe processes and metrics. Yet the history of the formation of such frameworks and devices, the work involved in negotiating and producing them, is relatively under-researched. In Chapter 1, David de Mortain examines the production of a risk management framework, which has provided the template and organizing reference point for many subsequent formalizations of risk management. He focuses on a small group of actors within an ad hoc committee created by the U.S. National Academy of Science, or National Research Council. Their task was to advise on the organization of regulatory agencies, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, and particularly on their use of science. The work of the committee to develop a generic framework and a kind of pure procedure for risk management presented the challenge of mediating and representing 3 different bodies of expertise and associated outlooks, namely, the scientific measurement and calculation of environmental or health risks, the economic calculation of costs and benefits of regulatory action, and the demands for transparency and accountability to audiences and constituencies of the agency. The chapter highlights the competences, resources, and political context of this work to develop a generic framework for decision-making, which was subsequently highly influential. De Mortain's argument emphasizes the effort involved to achieve the genericization, rationalization, and portability of risk knowledge. As the case of the EPA shows, frameworks acquire normativity as they become progressively purified of local and seemingly idiosyncratic elements. The echoes of this history can still be discerned within contemporary frameworks for so-called enterprise-wide risk management, despite their apparent naturalization, a naturalization reinforced by both professional and academic pedagogy. De Mortain also uses the case of the EPA to explain why some frameworking efforts are more successful than others. In Chapter 2, Sylvia Jordan and Lene Jorgensen deal with another readily familiar and highly institutionalized.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?